They said Ruth Calder was digging her own grave because she was building a wall of earth around the only shelter she had left. By the time the first blizzard came, she would either be dead inside it or the only one still alive. The blade bit into the prairie with a dull tearing sound. Ruth leaned her full weight against the iron handle, boots slipping in dry grass, arms trembling from the strain. The roots fought her, thick, tangled, stubborn, holding the ground together the way nothing else on that land ever did. She drove the cutter down again, harder this time. The earth split, a long strip peeling up in one heavy piece. She didn't stop. Couldn't, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. The wagon, the sound of it creaking under what little they had left, the way her mother wouldn't look at her, her father standing still beside the wheel, as if saying anything more might break something that couldn't be mended. "You're coming with us," he had said. Ruth had shaken her head. Once. That was all it took. No shouting, no dragging. Just silence. It was her brother who ended it. "You won't last the winter," he said. Not angry, not cruel. Certain. Ruth drove the blade down again. The memory cut cleaner than the iron. They had left her with the barn. The cabin too, but she already knew what it was worth. Nothing. Not against what was coming. She had spent 2 winters inside those walls, listening to the wind find its way in, through seams, through boards, through places no one had thought to seal. The stove never won. It only delayed the cold, until the wood ran low, and the cold finished what it had started. She had learned that much, and learning it had cost too much already. So she didn't fight the cabin, didn't try to fix it. She walked away from it. The barn stood lower, tighter, thick timber, less space to lose heat. Not warm, but not hopeless. Ruth straightened slowly, one hand pressed to her lower back. The strip of sod lay at her feet, dense, heavy, alive with roots. She cut it into blocks with short, sharp motions, each one the weight of something she could barely carry, then dragged them across the ground, back to the barn, where the wall was already rising. North side first, where the wind always came. Then the west. She laid each block carefully. Grass side down, pressed tight against the last, not touching the barn, never touching. She left a narrow space between, still air. That was the part no one understood, the part no one even saw. The wall wasn't the earth, it was the space behind it. Ruth stepped back once, just for a moment. The barn looked strange now, as if the prairie itself had begun to swallow it. A low shape, half-buried, wrong. She could see it the way others would. A girl alone, building a grave around herself. The thought didn't scare her. Not anymore. Because she had already seen what happened if she did nothing. Ruth wiped her hands against her skirt. They were split open in places. Blood dried into the dirt. She didn't look at them. Just reached for the cutter again. Set it into the ground. And pushed. Because winter wasn't coming. It was already on its way. And whatever this wall became, a shield, or a grave, it would decide everything. By the third day, Ruth could no longer close her hands completely. The skin across her palms had split, not clean, not shallow, deep enough that every grip of the cutter felt like tearing something open again. She adjusted, wrapped her hands in strips of cloth, tied them tight enough to hold, loose enough to move. Then went back to work, because the wall didn't care about pain, and neither did the wind. The sod grew heavier as she moved farther from the barn. Thicker roots, denser earth, harder to cut, harder to lift. She changed the pattern, cut shorter sections, stacked them closer, worked in lines instead of circles. North wall first, always the north, where the wind would hit hardest. She built it thicker than the rest, 2 layers of sod, pressed tight together. Then stepped inside the gap, measured it with her arm. 6 inches, enough to trap air, not enough to let it move. Still air held heat, moving air stole it. She had learned that the hard way, through nights where the fire burned strong, and the cold still found her bones. By midday, the sun sat high and useless, bright, but without warmth. Ruth worked through it, cut, lift, drag, set, again, and again, until the rhythm replaced everything else. Thought, memory, doubt, all of it buried beneath motion. Someone came on the 5th day. She heard the horse before she saw it, slow hooves across dry ground. Ruth didn't stop, didn't turn, just drove the cutter down again. "You planning to disappear in there?" The voice carried easy, confident. Ezekiel Boone, older, the kind of man who had survived enough winters to believe he understood them. Ruth lifted another block, dragged it into place, pressed it down with her heel. "You'll smother that barn," he went on. "Seal it up so tight nothing gets in." He shifted in the saddle, or out. That made her pause, only for a second. Then she set the next block. "I'm not sealing it." Boone gave a short breath, sounded almost like a laugh. "That's exactly what it looks like." Ruth stepped back, wiped her forearm across her face, left a streak of dirt and dried blood. "There's space," she said. Boone frowned slightly, looked closer, at the gap. At the gap. At the way the wall stood away from the wood. He leaned forward in the saddle. "Why?" The word came slower now, less certain. Ruth looked at the wall, then at the wind moving across the open land. "You don't stop the cold," she said. "You stop the wind." Boone sat with that a moment, eyes narrowing slightly, turning it over. Then he shook his head. Not convinced. Not even close. "You're burying yourself," he said. "Come January, you'll freeze in there same as anywhere else." Ruth didn't answer. Didn't argue. She just picked up another block. Set it in place. Boone watched her a moment longer, then pulled the reins. The horse turned. "If you change your mind," he called back, "I've got room." Not much. But more than that. Ruth didn't look up, didn't watch him go. Because she had already made the only decision that mattered. By the end of the week, the north wall stood complete, solid, unbroken. She moved to the west side next. The wind wall. The side that had always whispered through the cabin, even on the quietest nights.
She built that one thicker. 8 inches of space, more sod, more weight, each block harder to lift than the last. Her shoulders ached constantly now, a deep, dull burn that never left. But she didn't slow, couldn't. Because the first frost had already come. Thin ice along the water trough, brittle grass underfoot, a warning, not of what might happen, but of what would. Ruth stood inside the gap once, midway through the west wall, hands pressed against the barn on one side, and the sod on the other. She closed her eyes. Felt the air between them, still, held, it wasn't warm yet, not even close. But it wasn't moving. And that was the beginning. She opened her eyes, stepped back out, reached for another block. Because the wall wasn't finished. Not even close. And until it was, everything she had left was still exposed.
The first night she slept in the barn. The wind came early. Not a storm, not yet, just a steady push across the prairie. Ruth lay on the rough boards, blankets pulled tight around her shoulders, listening. The same sound she had heard for years, wind pressing against wood. Searching, testing. She waited for it, for the thin whistle through cracks. For the cold air slipping in, finding her face. It didn't come, not the way it used to. The sound was there, but something had changed. The force of it felt, broken, not gone, but slowed. As if something outside was taking the hit first. Ruth opened her eyes, stared into the dark, then pushed herself up slowly. She stepped toward the wall, placed her hand against the inner boards, waited. Cold, but not cutting, not biting through the wood the way it always had. She moved to the other side, north wall, the worst of it, pressed her palm there. Held it longer this time, feeling. The cold was still there, but it wasn't moving. It wasn't pushing. It just sat. Ruth let out a slow breath. Not relief, not yet. Proof. The wall was doing something. Not everything, but something. She stepped back, looked around the barn. The space was smaller than the cabin. Lower. Easier to hold heat. If the heat stayed, if the wind didn't take it, she lay back down, pulled the blankets tighter, and listened again. The wind pressed, the wall took it, and for the first time in 3 winters, she slept through the night. Morning came pale and cold. Frost along the inside edges of the door. Thin ice in the water bucket, but the air inside was different. Not warm, but held, contained. Ruth stood in the center of the barn, breathing, watching the way her breath moved. It rose, then stayed, didn't get pulled toward the walls. She stepped closer to the north side, placed her hand against the boards again, measured it in her own way. Still cold, but steady, not changing with each gust outside. That mattered, more than heat, because if it stayed steady, she could build from there. She worked faster after that. Not stronger. Not less tired. Certain. The south wall came next. Then the east. Each side closing the barn in. Layer by layer. Earth rising around it. By the 10th day, the structure looked different. Lower. Buried. The barn no longer stood against the prairie. It sat inside it, like something the land had decided to keep. Virgil passed by that afternoon. Didn't stop at first, just slowed his horse. Then circled back, looking, trying to make sense of it. "You still at this?" he called. Ruth didn't answer, just said another block. "You know what folks are saying. She kept working. Didn't look up. They say when the snow comes, you won't even be able to get out. They say you're sealing yourself in. That made her stop. Only for a moment. Then she turned, looked at him. Good, she said. Virgil frowned. Didn't understand. Good, he repeated. Ruth wiped her hands slowly. Eyes steady on him. If the wind can't get in, I don't need to get out. He stared at her, then let out a short laugh. Shook his head. That's not how winter works. Ruth didn't argue. Didn't explain. Because she wasn't guessing. She had felt it already. In the walls. In the air. Something had changed. And it was enough. Virgil rode off, still shaking his head. The sound of the horse fading into the open land. Carried by wind that never stopped moving. Ruth turned back to the wall. The last section. The gap still open. She stepped inside it once more. Stood between wood and earth. Eyes closed. The air held around her. Not warm. But quiet. Protected. Different from anything above ground. She opened her eyes. Looked up at the sky. Thin clouds moving faster now. The wind shifting. Not stronger. More constant. That was how it started. Not with a storm, with a change. Ruth stepped out of the gap. Lifted the final block. Set it into place. And as her hands pressed it down, she felt it. The first real edge of winter. Not in the air, but in time. Whatever was coming, it wasn't far anymore. And this wall was about to be tested. The storm did not arrive with snow. It arrived with silence. The wind stopped first. Not faded, not weakened, stopped. The prairie went still. Flat, endless. Waiting. Ruth stood outside the barn, one hand resting against the sod wall, feeling it. Solid. The air had changed. She could feel it in her chest, that tight, quiet pressure before something breaks. She didn't go back to the cabin, didn't even look at it, because she already knew it wouldn't hold. The first gust came without warning, a sudden force across the open land, strong enough to bend the grass flat in a single motion. Then another, then more, each one harder than the last. By dusk, the wind was constant, not pushing, driving. Snow followed after dark, not falling, flying. It came sideways, sharp, endless. The world disappeared within an hour. Ruth closed the barn door, dropped the bar into place, checked it once, then again. The first impact hit moments later. Wind against the outer wall, heavy. The barn creaked, the wood flexing under the pressure, a sound she knew too well. She waited, listening for the next part, the cold slipping through. It didn't come. The wind hit again, stronger this time, driving against the sod. The outer wall took it. The impact dull, absorbed. Ruth stepped toward the north side, pressed her hand against the inner boards, held it there. The force was gone, not outside, but inside. The wind didn't reach her, not anymore. She moved to the west wall, the worst of it, the side that had always failed first. Another gust hit, hard enough to shake the structure, snow striking like sand. She kept her hand on the wood, feeling, waiting. Nothing pushed through, no sudden drop in air, no cutting edge of cold, only stillness. The storm built through the night, hour after hour, never easing. The barn groaned under it, wood shifting, sod settling. Ruth stayed awake, not from fear, from focus. She moved from wall to wall, checking each side, measuring in her own way. North, west, east, each one holding. Each one doing exactly what she had built it to do. By morning, the snow had buried half the wall, drifts rising against the sod, sealing it further. The wind didn't stop. It pressed harder, but the outer wall took it. The space between stayed still, and the inner boards held. Ruth checked the water bucket, a thin layer of ice, no deeper. She checked the air again, breathing slow, watching the way it moved. It stayed, didn't get pulled, didn't vanish. That was enough, more than enough. By the second night, she heard something new. Not wind, not wood, a sound beneath it, a voice, faint, carried between gusts. Ruth froze, head turning slightly, listening. There, again. A shout. She moved to the door, hand steady on the bar, then stopped. If she opened it wrong, the wind would come in. Everything she had built, gone in seconds. She waited, listened again. The voice came clearer this time. Ruth. Desperate. Close. She lifted the bar. Slowly. Controlled. Cracked the door just enough. The wind forced its way through the gap. Sharp. Violent. A figure stumbled against it. Half blind. Snow-covered. Ezekiel Boone. He pushed through the opening, nearly falling. Ruth slammed the door shut behind him, dropped the bar. The wind cut off instantly, silence returning. Boone stood there, breathing hard, looking around, at the walls, at the space, at the air. He took a step forward, then another. Slow, warm, he said. Not a question. Not disbelief. Recognition. Ruth didn't answer. She didn't need to, because he could feel it. The same thing she had felt days before. The difference. The proof. Boone turned slowly, looked back at the door, at the storm trying to tear it open, then back at her. Something had changed in his face. Not pride. Not certainty. Something quieter. Understanding. He didn't say anything else. Just moved toward the wall, placed his hand against it, and stood there, feeling the stillness. While outside, winter tried to break everything that wasn't built to survive it. The storm held for 8 days. 8 days of wind that never stopped. 8 days of snow that erased the land. From inside the barn, time didn't move the same way. There was no sky to measure it, no horizon. Only sound, wind against earth, then silence. Ruth and Boone spoke little, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been proven. They worked instead. Small things. Keeping the space ordered, checking the walls, watching the air, listening. Boone moved differently now, slower, more careful with where he placed his weight, as if the ground itself deserved more respect than he had given it before. On the third day, he stood near the north wall, hand pressed against the boards, just as Ruth had done. How thick? He asked. 8 inches, she said. North side. He nodded, took that in. Not as opinion, as fact. And the gap? 6. Less on the east. Boone let out a slow breath. Not surprise. Recognition. Still air, he said. That's what you built. Ruth didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because now, he understood. On the 5th day, the wind changed. Not weaker, but different. Less force, more drift. Snow settling instead of striking. The storm loosening its hold. Ruth felt it first. Not in the walls, in the air. That pressure again, but this time, releasing. She stood, walked to the door. Rested her hand against the bar. Waited. Listening. No sharp gust. No sudden push. She lifted the bar slowly. Opened the door. A narrow crack. Cold air slipped in, but not violently, not fighting. She opened it wider. Stepped outside. The world had changed. The prairie was gone, buried under a single, unbroken field of white. Fences swallowed. Tracks erased. The cabin, half hidden. Ruth bent, it wouldn't have held. She knew that without stepping closer. Without needing to check. Boone came to the doorway behind her, stood there a moment. Looking out. At what was left. At what wasn't. Then he stepped down beside her. Neither spoke. Because there was nothing left to argue. Nothing left to prove. The storm had already done that. They found the others over the next days. Some in cabins that had failed, some in drifts too deep to escape. A few, who had tried to reach help. And hadn't made it. Ruth and Boone buried them where they could, marked what they couldn't, remembered the rest. When the paths opened again, people came. Not many at first, just those who had heard. About the girl who stayed, about the barn that held, about the wall. They stood where Boone had stood, hands against the wood, feeling the same stillness. Asking the same questions, getting the same answers. Less talk, more watching, more understanding. By the next winter, 3 more barns had walls like hers. Then 5, then more. The prairie began to change. Not in how it looked, but in how it was survived. Boone built his the following spring, measured it himself, set the gap exact. He didn't speak about it much, didn't need to, because everyone knew where it had come from. Ruth stayed where she was, through that winter, through the next. And the one after that. She kept the wall repaired, pressed new sod where it settled, watched for weak places, because wind never stopped trying. It never would. But now, it had something in its way, something that didn't fight it, just broke it. Years later, people stopped telling the story the way it started.
They didn't talk about the girl who was left behind, or the one who refused to leave. They talked about the wall, the one that held, the one that outlasted every storm. Ruth never corrected them, never added anything, because the truth was simple. She hadn't beaten the winter, she hadn't fought it, she had changed how it reached her, and in that small difference, in that narrow space of still air, everything had changed. Some people survive by enduring, others, by understanding. Ruth Calder had done both, and when the next storm came, it found her waiting, not afraid, not exposed, but buried just deep enough that the wind could no longer touch her.